So, black swans. And how weird does weird get? Um, it gets pretty weird. So, in order to kind of go through this exercise, what you're going to need to imagine is you're going to need to contextualize the fact that you're going to live to be about 30,000 and change days old. Now, I want you to conceptualize the worst day of your life. The worst day. And it probably involves, some terrible things happening. Someone getting really hurt, a loved one dying, combinations thereof. And I want you to ask yourself, does that day involve emergency services like policemen, EMTs, those kinds of people? And it probably does. In fact, you probably don't need to get to the worst day of your life to involve emergency services. But just for the sake of it, let's just say 1 in 30,000 days of your life is going to involve some kind of emergency call like that. Well, if you live in a town of 1 million people, when we scale this up, it turns out that emergency services where you live in this hypothetical town of 1 million people will have to deal with roughly 30 calls like that. Roughly that many every day. That means yesterday they dealt with the worst day of your life 30 times, and 30 and change times. And then today they're going to deal with it that many times, and then tomorrow and so on for entire careers. In fact, that's what they have to deal with. So this contextualizes a level of scale, a selection of the worst day of your life and how normal that is for like a police officer or an emergency medical technician. So I want you to think about the weirdest thing that's ever happened to you. The weirdest thing, the hardest to explain, holy crap, weirdest thing. And I want you to contextualize it yet again. 1 in 30,000 days, weirdest day of your life, great. Think of the fact that you have about 150 people, roundabouts, that you can call on the first name basis, and they know who you are, you know who they are, and you can talk. It's called Dunbar's number. It's a thing in anthropology. Roundabouts 150 people is typical for a person to have 150 active contacts at any given time. So, if you ask everyone that you know, everybody that you know, the weirdest thing that has ever happened to them, you end up with the weirdest thing out of anybody you know is like a 1 in 35 million chance. Every one of them is going to live for about 30,000 days on average. And you have 150 of them. So let's just say like 1 in 50 million. Okay, so sure, why not? 1 in 50 million is the weirdest thing that has ever happened in the life of everybody that you know. So in a nation the size of the United States, we have about 350 million Americans. That means on the daily, every day, a nation the scale of America is producing 7 of those once in everybody you've ever heard of's lifetime weird level of weird. That's the scale of weird that's going on 7 times a day. And what that ends up looking like is it ends up looking like things that are super far removed from your conceptualization of normal. Things like, all of the most powerful men in the nation gathering together in the woods of Northern California to worship an owl named Moloch. and do God knows what, right? It's super removed from your perception of normal and my perception of normal as well, but it's still happening. It's still real. Okay? Now the scale gets even worse because there's 8 billion humans, not just 350, there's 8 billion humans on the planet, which means on the daily, hundreds of times, the weirdest thing is happening. The weirdest thing you've ever heard of is happening on the daily, every hundreds of times a day. In fact, in that selection of 100, 20, there's a thing called the Pareto distribution where it's the 80-20 rule. So of that selection of 100 things that are happening every day that are weirder than anything you've ever heard of on the global scale, the top 20 weirdest things have 80% of the weird of that distribution. And the scale doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there because you have to start factoring in time and how many generations there's been. And you have to start factoring in the fact that, history has a horizon. We only have written history for about 9,000 years, and every indication that we have, it seems to hint that time obviously doesn't stop just because we don't remember it. So were there weird things going on in our history? And then here's the other thing. Not just in our history, but these once in so often really weird, really momentous events tend to be really momentous. Like they hold more punching power for changing frameworks, for changing the concept of what is normal than obviously normal things. So when you see like a UFO or something, that changes your perspective. So when you factor in how many of these really weird black swan event type things have occurred to in my society, in my species before I was ever born, and how much of what is normal is really framed by these extremely abnormal things having already happened before I was born without me knowing. And the logical inference there is that, yeah, the majority of your life is framed by this fringe of extremely unrelatably weird stuff. So when you hear rationalists and people, dismiss conspiracy theories and dismiss, skepticism, doubt, and suspicion, and tell you to kind of stick to your knitting and just work within the framework of normal, there are substantial exceptions to what they're proposing there, right? That is not actually rational. It's pragmatic in that it keeps you focused on, your 30,000 days and keeps you working and paying taxes. But it's not accurate at describing, reality outside of your perception. So those are black swan events explained. It's the exercise to contextualize the weird and the scaling of weird and how that gets way outside of our perspective really quickly. So that's today's video.